am so excited to welcome Elle Johnson to Dialogue Podcast. Hi, Elle, how are you?
Hi, Rebecca. So nice to hear your voice. I'm doing well.
Good, good. Yeah, we've had a long Twitter and email correspondence. It's really nice to see your face, hear your voice.
Yes. I'm
Welcome.
glad we were able to connect.
Me too. Me too. So I think what was most thrilling after I discovered your book, which totally caught my eye because it's a memoir of family and forgiveness. That's the subtitle, Under the Officer's Daughter. So I know there's going to be criminal justice themes, forgiveness, family. Memoir is my favorite genre in general for a book. If you throw in any kind of crime aspect, I'm pretty much sold. But as I found out more about you, I learned that you're responsible for so many iconic scripted crime shows, starting with Homicide Life on the Street, which I have to say, and we'll get into this, your dad features heavily in the book. He's a parole officer. And
Yes.
my dad is not in law enforcement, but I grew up watching Cops with him. And then we moved into Homicide Life in the Streets. This was my dad's show, and he shared it with me. So there's already a connection, but I'd love to hear how you got into writing and producing for television.
I feel like crime and crime drama has been an obvious part of my life for most of my life. But my specific interest in writing for television and writing cop shows, stems from the fact that my dad was a parole officer, but it was kind of a long journey for me to get to the point where I figured out that I wanted to write for television, especially after I decided that I wanted to be a writer. Figuring out what type of writing I wanted to do was a more circuitous route. And long story short, I got my first break writing for television from an esteemed TV writer named David Black, who was a longtime writer on Law and Order. And I happened to be working at the box office at the Public Theater in Manhattan, and he came in to pick up tickets. And because I was trying to figure out how to be a writer and studying writers that I loved, I had come across his work. And when I saw the name David Black on a credit card, I immediately asked, "Oh, are you the David Black who writes for Law and Order?" And I think that kind of freaked David out a little bit. And so under the guise of keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, he wanted to know who I was and why I knew who he was. And I, told him I was an aspiring writer and loved Law and Order. And he ended up inviting me to lunch, reading some of my scripts. And then when he got an opportunity to showrun on a show, he offered me a job as a script coordinator on the show. And so that was kind of my easy entree into the entertainment business. I got to work with some incredible TV writers, like a gentleman named Eric Overmeyer, who then became kind of my mentor. And it was through working on this show that was basically about a forensic scientist that I started to realize, hey, I kind of understand this world, these characters, because of my family members writing about law enforcement. And that's when it kind of occurred to me that I really wanted to pursue television and be a TV writer, just from being up close and personal with writers on that show. In particular, as I mentioned, Eric Overmeyer, who then went on to work on Homicide Life on the Streets, which was also one of my favorites and one of my dad's favorites as well. So an incredible opportunity to tell stories and kind of dip my toe in the waters of writing for cop shows on television.
That story with David Black and meeting him is such a quintessential New York story. I hope those still happen. I fear they don't, but just the, right place, right time, the courage to reach out and say, "Are you the David Black?" That's so scary, and good for you for doing it. And I love that how he responded.
I don't think I knew any better. I think if I'd stopped and thought about it, I would have prevented myself from doing it. But I was just so thrilled that he was there.
Sometimes the best part, like if you're just young and naive enough and
Yes.
hopeful enough to have that moment. So maybe we could lay the groundwork of the book a little bit, the main plot points, which center around the just tragic and unexpected murder of your cousin who was your age, and the unique position your family is in, as your dad is a parole officer in New York City. You lived in Queens. I live in Queens, by the way. And your uncle is a homicide detective, your uncle being Karen, your cousin's father.
Yeah.
So why don't we set the scene a little bit? I also loved learning about Queens and Manhattan in the 80s, because that was just 10 years before my arrival to New York City. So yeah, tell us a little bit about the book.
The book is about when I was 16, my 16-year-old cousin Karen was murdered in a robbery gone awry at a local Burger King in the Bronx. And because my dad was a parole officer and her father was a decorated homicide detective in Manhattan, I got a front and center look at the investigation into who had murdered her. It was also because her father was a homicide detective. It was all over the local news in New York. It was a big deal and a splashy headline, homicide detective's daughter murdered. And so for me, this event, because I was only 16 years old, Karen was only 16, was really pivotal for me. It felt like my childhood loss of innocence, an event that really shaped me. And while it was happening, I felt like I really recognized that everything in my life was about to change, that this was going to be, things were going to be different. There was kind of pre-Karen's murder and post-Karen's murder. And a lot of things did change in ways that I couldn't have anticipated and in ways that I really hadn't processed when I was 16, that it really took decades later for me to appreciate and understand how these events had shaped me and influenced my way of thinking and my way of interacting, and really changed a lot of interactions within my own family. So the book is about Karen's murder and the 2-week period during the aftermath when it was investigated not only by the NYPD, there was an FBI manhunt in tracking down the boys who were involved, but it's also about my cousin Karen's brother sent an email asking that we all write letters to the parole board requesting that one of the boys not be let out of prison. He'd been in for over 30 years, so he was in his 50s, just like I am. And that request kind of sent me down the rabbit hole of asking the question, is this what I wanted to do? Did I want to take that kind of a stand? And who were these boys who had committed this horrible act? Who were they? Who had they grown into? Like, what kind of men were they now? So it really sent me on a journey of exploration that extended not only to these men that I didn't know, but also deeper within myself and my relationships within my own family and my relationship with Karen, what I perceived it to be and what it really was.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because the big themes in the book are very present and visible and tangible in a way. But there's some really unique qualities about it that I found just as compelling, because again, I love memoir. And so it's these little moments in memoirs where you can have a very different upbringing and lifestyle and set of circumstances than the author and still be pulled into these moments that are very relatable. And when you go back in time and go through your memories of going through school in the aftermath, sometimes it was like painfully, I don't want to say cringy, but like visceral. How do you grieve publicly as a teenager? You kind of wanted people to remember it and to bring you into the narrative, but you were also moving away from it. And it's also confusing. And I think I would assume a lot of us haven't had the same exact circumstance, but I have been in middle school and high school and had something huge in my life happen and want everyone to talk about it and no one to look at me. Like, these these paradoxical moments of just figuring stuff out and no one can do anything right. And so that was a part of your story. It was like this longing to be closer to her than you were, and so you share all the memories you have of her, the really big important ones like her birthday party, and you process that out loud essentially.
Yeah, I mean, that was, for me, that was really a big part of wanting to write this book. And I feel like because as the events unfolded with Karen, they were so vivid to me when I was 16 and experiencing them. I really had the sensation of like kind of almost stepping out of my own body and watching this thing unfold, even as I was in it. So I had really, really vivid memories of a lot of it that I would draw on. But in going back to those memories, I realized I could go even deeper into the feelings that I experienced, just being a teenager and feeling isolated, feeling like you're an outsider, that you don't belong, kind of remembering the people who meant something to you, who you wanted to be closer to, but not really understanding how to do that. And that kind of propelled me into an exploration of how I had been raised, the things that I learned as a result of being a parole officer's daughter, often feeling like I was raised like I was on parole myself.
Yes.
But that desire, like, as you said, that desire to really be seen in a bizarre way, it's like wanting people to see you without wanting to be looked at, which
Exactly.
seems like such a contradiction. And yet in many ways, I think, you know, writing the book was cathartic for me because I still feel that in some ways. You know, I'm a writer, so I don't consider myself somebody who is an extrovert or an exhibitionist. I like to process my feelings on the page. You know, that's often the most comfortable way for me. And yet there are many things that I feel like, you know, I want to express. I want the world to know about me, but I don't necessarily want to be looked at while I'm sharing it.
Oh,
So
totally.
in a bizarre way, it's a way of being open and, you know, inviting intimacy in a larger sense, without feeling some of the discomfort that can come along with that, if that makes sense.
It sure does. And, you know, I think like so many things that happen in your book, it takes these larger kind of thematic topics and really personalizes them and shows how complex they are. It's how I prefer to talk about issues in criminal justice. But we've talked about your dad. I think we have to talk about him more. He's a big figure in your life. He was, and unfortunately he's passed. But can you talk about, illuminate, you said it was like being on parole, being his daughter. And I have to say, for living in New York City in the 80s, your life was pretty sheltered.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that he was a parole officer. He was very aware of the dangers that were out there, the unseen dangers. You know, he worked at the parole office building, which was on 42nd Street, right next to the Port Authority. And, you know, so to him, it's like he recognized that on any given day, there were, you know, thousands of parolees walking around in that area, that these were people who had been let out of prison, who were still acclimating. You know, one of his famous quotes that he always said was that you can't rehabilitate somebody who's never been habilitated to begin with. And so he just had this kind of, you know, ingrown fear of bad things happening. And I think that he was also a very controlling personality, but that coupled with his fear for his children, you know, really restricted our movements and made me in particular very controlled. You know, I was a good girl. I always did what I was told and followed the rules. And kind of Karen's murder was the thing that really cracked that open for me and made me start to think, well, what is the point of following the rules if bad things can happen to you when you follow them anyway? Like, why not break out of that to some degree? But, you know, my dad was definitely a larger than life personality, a big character, and a big influence in my life. I think a lot of my growing up was spent trying to get his approval. And, you know, a lot of my adulthood, honestly, has been spent trying to get his approval through writing cop shows and through, you know, telling his stories in many ways and trying to understand his perspective. In a lot of instances, I've definitely carried that with me to a large degree.
Is there any character you've written more than others that has really embodied your dad's spirit or perspective? And I would love to.
Oh my God, I'm always writing about my dad. I mean,
I'm sure.
you know, I've had many opportunities from, you know, working on Homicide to Law and Order. I also worked on a show that was called Street Time that was about a parole officer parolee relationship. And, you know, one of the reasons that I was hired to work on the show is because I really understood that dynamic and understood the parole officer perspective and point of view. And that was a show where I was able to take a lot of my dad's stories and, you know, put them on the screen. I've also definitely taken parts of my father's personality and kind of tried to explore those through characters. When I was a younger writer starting out and you know, just trying to learn how to write dialogue and have voices for different characters, I would often, if I felt like I couldn't create a voice for a character, I would often just kind of fall back on my dad's voice.
Sure.
You know, and because it's such a dynamic voice. And so, you know, giving his voice to different characters that I was writing. So he's been a tremendous part of my career and almost every story that I've written. I've also written a ton of episodes that take pieces of my relationship with Karen or pieces of the incident that happened to Karen. I've definitely used that directly in episodes, but I have also kind of drawn on my experience with that trauma to really make a character's experience come to life on the page, and kind of understanding, the sort of moment by moment changes that happen when you're experiencing something like that. I mean, I've been really conscious in my own writing of, it's particularly when you're writing sort of an action sequence or a sequence where someone is getting shot and killed, that, there are so many changes, visceral changes going on for everyone involved, that it's not just you pull a trigger and it's over, that there are really so many emotions that you cycle through. And I've always tried to, in my writing, explore that, probably because it's just a question that lives with me, that I feel like, yeah, how do these acts happen? How does someone get to the point where they're able to pull a trigger? What is it like to be on the other side of that? How do both families react? I'm very aware of those questions when I'm writing.
Yeah, it's the humanity of it. I mean,
Yeah.
probably anybody could write an action sequence with violence. And I think, we see those scenes in movies and in some shows, and then you see some that have like this heart and this authenticity and this human element. And that's what you bring to the scripts, which is amazing. Speaking about the genre itself, true crime and scripted crime, why do you think we are just so drawn into, what is kind of dark and violent? Like, we tune into both of these, usually on my show, we're talking a lot about true crime, but the shows you've worked for, and we should mention Bosch, more
Yes.
currently, people, I mean, we can't get enough. Like, how do you view that? How do you explain it? Or don't you even bother trying?
I mean, I explain it as it's the highest stakes possible. Taking a human life is the ultimate in conflict and drama, and the ultimate loss. So you're really playing to the highest stake that can possibly exist. And I think that for me personally, just having experienced that kind of trauma, I'm drawn to try to understand it. And I think for most of us, it's an incomprehensible situation. You can't believe that something like that can happen. And I think it's devastating when it does. And I think that is the kind of maudlin, for lack of a better word, attraction or appeal of it. It's something that you never expect to experience. And because it's so unexpected, you're drawn to it. We all know that everyone's going to die at some point, but the fascination with someone dying ahead of their time in a way that's really violent, it's just something that you can't look away from. So I feel like we're drawn to it, and hopefully it draws us to the larger questions of life that make, living so much more important and meaningful. You have to look at death in order to give even more meaning to life, I feel.
Oh my gosh. Yes, 100% everything you're saying. It's exactly why I started this podcast. I think we use true crime. This is my personal philosophy, which is pretty in line with what you're saying, almost as a vehicle for those of us who've not experienced the firsthand trauma to get closer to it safely. And it's entertainment too, right? So there's this, dual thing happening of like learning and experiencing it, and also we're being entertained. And then I agree, the closeness to and the proximity then should hopefully spark conversations about what's really at the heart of the story, because it's actually rarely ever a murder. I mean, when you break down what happened at that Burger King, where there were kids working and kids committing a crime, that's about so many other things. It was a robbery gone wrong. The story of Santiago Ramirez, he has a story just like Karen did. And, that's to me what the good true crime stories and the good scripted stories do.
Well, part of what was so interesting for me writing the book, finally, was being able to look into the individual stories of the boys, now men, involved, and going beyond their stories to their family members. The fact that, there were other people affected by this. One of the more touching things that I found was learning about Francisco Alamar, who was one of the boys who was let out earlier, but, just learning about his ability in prison to find love, to have a girlfriend and get married, and to actually cobble together some kind of life, to have children. and to have children who he then felt accountable for, as a result of having been involved in this tragedy with Karen, that he felt like, he owed his own children some explanation as to what he had done. And so these crimes, there's not just one victim involved. Everybody becomes a victim. It ruins families on both sides of the story. And that, to me, enlightening, but also something really important to delve into, because I feel like, particularly when, writing for television shows, I never want to forget that it's not just a suspect, that there's a whole backstory for that suspect, that, people are not good or bad, but that they do good or bad things. And I feel like that's an important distinction to make, because none of us wants to be judged by the worst thing that we've ever done in our lives. And, so that, looking at that for the boys involved and being able to kind of extend that to not only my father, but to myself, how we all want to be forgiven, that we are all capable of terrible things. And I think what happened to Karen, the tragedy of it, and realizing that given the right circumstances or the wrong circumstances, we could all be in a similar situation. We're all capable of great good and great bad.
Yes. You mentioned your cousin. So this is years and years later. The men have been convicted and parole hearings are coming up. And your cousin, Karen's brother, asks you to weigh in and to write the parole board and say, we do not believe he should be released. They just want letters of support. So that's a big chunk of the book, is you're wrestling with that. And it's quite a ride, because we think you're going one way. And I don't know how much we want to say, because I really do. If people haven't read it, I want people to read it and be on that ride. But can you talk about the process and what you even learned about, beyond what you knew from your father, about how parole works, and what you discovered about this young man, or now grown man, in prison?
Yeah, I mean, the process really, and I definitely don't want to give anything away, because I feel like that's part of the journey for the reader as well, in terms of wrestling with the idea of forgiveness and what is forgiveness and when do you give forgiveness. But the process for me was really one of trying to assess as honestly and impartially as I could who these boys were, who they were when they committed the crime, and who they had become as a result of being in prison, and how that prison experience, can shape you in ways that may be counter to what you would do on the outside. But so my process was really to kind of get as much information as I could. And so I was able to get court transcripts, or I tried to get the hearing transcripts from the trial, but those were not available. So I was able to get something that actually I think ended up being more valuable, which was the pre-trial motion hearings, which are when the prosecution and defense are discussing what can and cannot be put into evidence, which of course, if I just had the trial transcripts, I never would have had access to.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So that was really enlightening in terms of what the defense wanted to keep out, or what the prosecution wanted to put in, what actually happened. And so that was enlightening for me to kind of understand who the boys were going into this. And then I further went and got the parole board transcripts. So I was able to kind of see over the course of decades how these boys, now men, kind of framed what they had done, how their stories evolved and changed, how they also evolved and changed as human beings. And it was really interesting to kind of just see that on the page, through the chronology of these transcripts, and get a better understanding, or as much of an understanding as I could, without being able to directly speak with them, of their experience of trying to reconcile with what they had done, whether or not they were trying to reconcile it, or simply just trying to get out of prison. So for me, it was interesting in a lot of ways. I think my kind of training at that point as a television writer was really helpful in terms of thinking of them in terms of characters, how you create a character. And so being able to be somewhat impartial in terms of thinking, okay, if I were creating this character, how would I respond to them? So that enabled me to kind of, in a way, take a step back, even though I felt like I was always getting pulled back into the emotion of it. Like I remember I would get, these big manila envelopes from the Department of Corrections. And sometimes I just couldn't even open them. I just knew it would be so emotional that I would put them in a drawer and wait weeks to look at them, just because I couldn't emotionally deal with what I thought I would find out or what was in it. And so just even that process, I just felt like I had to kind of try to mitigate my own emotion so that I could be as impartial as possible as I considered all this. And of course, I think, you'll see on the page and the chapters that the emotion always creeps in, and it was always difficult to kind of get to that place. But I felt like I really did try to use some of my TV writing training and say, okay, if this person were a character that I were writing, like, how would I feel about them? And how would I justify or understand their actions, what they are doing? And that was really helpful in terms of processing what was happening.
Yeah, what a great, resource and this tool you had at your disposal to use. It's really interesting because that would help in terms of trying to get your head around some of this. And like so many people's journeys, theirs weren't linear. Like Santiago had a lot of accomplishments in prison, and he achieved a lot, and he also got in fights and had infractions and issues with guards. And it's never all or nothing, one or the other. It's like both can be true. And then it only makes it harder when you're trying to decide, what do I say about his parole release, when both things are fact.
Right. I mean, and I think that really just brought home for me the idea that, you're not just talking about a number or a statistic, that we're talking about actual human beings, who have personalities, who have good days and bad days, who are part of a system that, is maybe structured in such a way that it just wants to churn through process and, get people moving through the system, which is not always the best way to service actual human beings, that you have to take into account variables and really consider things. And unfortunately, a lot of times the system doesn't have the time to do that.
Yeah, it's not designed for that. And since you brought us up systems, this occurred to me this morning, and you might be like, this is crazy, I don't know how to speak to this, but I was just, rereading a few passages from your book, and on page 202, I wrote this down. You wrote, "The unexpected happened. The tension inside me came undone. It loosened, then dissipated. I felt something that up until then I wasn't really sure existed. Closure." So what it made me actually think of is I got to visit Rwanda twice, and I got to meet with survivors of the genocide, perpetrators and surviving victims whose families had been killed. And their justice system, obviously very different from the American modern criminal justice system. However, one of the men I met almost said something so similar to that. And it didn't strike me when I first read your book, but it really struck me this morning. And he talked about something being unlocked that had been locked up. And that from that, a lot of things flowed that he had not allowed. And so I was wondering, and so these two men, so the two men I met, one had killed the other man's entire family. But the government was forcing them to work together. He had to move back to his village. They didn't have room in the prisons. I mean, the way they had to deal with it was it's so foreign to us. So it's this restorative justice, and they needed them to repair the villages. Like, it was practical, it was spiritual, because I think they believed this would be best for everyone in terms of a healing moving forward, but it was also very practical. They needed every capable man and woman to come back and help. So my question, I suppose, if I have one, is, how can you consider something like that when looking at our system here, which is, like you're saying, not designed for variables and even like relational progress. But there's some universal qualities to what happens when you reconcile with people and with really terrible deeds. So I guess I'm just asking for your response to that, if you have one.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting because I definitely, part of my process in writing the book and also kind of looking to what other people have written about forgiveness, trying to figure out what forgiveness is, and realizing there is a whole restorative justice movement, there's definitely a push for that here in this country. I don't know, how far along it's gotten in terms of our actual justice system, but there are definitely avenues for restorative justice, for helping people to reconcile so that you can rebuild communities and help people to get past their anger, because what's the saying, an eye for an eye and then everybody is blind. You can't just continue to harbor anger and these terrible feelings that are not only not good for you, but not good for the rest of the people around you. So I think it makes a lot of sense to kind of look towards that when we're thinking about criminal justice, to not just throw people completely away. Yes, people need to be punished for their crimes. And yes, there are definitely crimes that I feel, it's so hard to come back from, that, the rehabilitation or the punishment needs to be extreme, but that's not to say that that's the end of it. Prisons shouldn't just be warehouses for people. It should be a way to, rehabilitate and reintegrate back into society. And I think that we need to really look at that going forward. And, who knows if we'll have the wherewithal, but just even thinking about what you're saying about the situation with those two Rwandan families, I mean, that I'm sure that was difficult, but certainly no more difficult than living with the pain and the trauma, at least feeling like you are in some way working towards a resolution that you can live with, an understanding. And I love the way you say, it's like unlocking something, because that really speaks to the idea that we have the keys. You have to unlock it for yourself. It's not something that's going to happen, just because time passes. You really have to actively work at it and work through these things, and not shove these feelings or sweep these feelings under the carpet. We really need to be looking at our trauma and trying to work through our trauma.
Yeah, and it's an empowering of yourself to unlock it and not also making it someone else's responsibility.
Yeah.
Which I think is hard.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. One of the things that I did here in LA some years ago is I went through a training to work with the police department. It's through the mayor's office, but you work with the police department and the fire department, and it's called CRT, the Crisis Response Team.
Yeah.
And what it is volunteers who are trained for over the course of several months in how to deal with victims of crime and their families, particularly the family members, to really, when somebody has been murdered or killed in an accident, it's a way for volunteers to kind of step in and help people immediately start to deal with the trauma. And they give you this incredible training that's all about just learning how to listen and learning how to present an avenue for people to express their grief and to express their feelings, so that the healing process can kind of start immediately, and that they're not saddled with this kind of trauma. And one of the things that, of course, they also talk about is secondary trauma. And as people who are dealing with this, how you yourself can be triggered. And it was interesting, I went through the training, and I would go to be called out to crime scenes. And one of the things they ask you is to consider your own triggers and things that might bring up other traumas for you. And I hadn't really considered before I started doing this, that the reason I was doing it was because of Karen, because I wanted, I somehow wanted to give back to people who might be in a similar situation, the ability to start thinking about what they were feeling, to start dealing with it. And I think it makes a tremendous difference that you not, push it aside, that you not, push down those tears and not deal with it. I think dealing with it is the best way to kind of move forward and understand what's happening to you.
Yeah, that's amazing. It made me think while you were talking, I know that LAPD is such a large agency. They also have resources for law enforcement. And that's another side of trauma that I think is the other half of this story, which is making sure our officers are dealing with this and being cared for mentally. Do you feel like that was part of the NYPD culture in the 80s? I'm guessing not.
I don't really think so. I mean, it's interesting. I think that that is definitely a part of the equation that, as you're saying, it's like I would have loved to explore more in the book. And I kind of do with, my dad and my dad's reaction to the type of work that he did. But I certainly feel, there didn't seem to be enough attention paid to how detective's daughter being murdered might have affected an entire police force,
Right.
the fear that exists and how that kind of translates to how you act and present when you're doing your own job. Certainly that night when I, am sitting in my aunt's house and kind of overhearing the discussions of what to do if they find the boys who did this to Karen, you realize that there's a lot of emotion, that everyone is being traumatized and that not everyone is getting any kind of help that they need.
Right. And even your dad's day-to-day role,
Yeah,
probably he could have used some system in place to be debriefing and processing that.
absolutely.
And as a Black officer within a culture that was still experiencing a lot of tension and racism.
Yes, for sure. I think that, I think there were kind of ad hoc and smaller out of the job ways and systems. My dad certainly had a really close knit group of coworkers that he relied on. But I think in terms of really processing it, it's one of those things where you're just kind of putting your head down and doing the job until it builds up and builds up. And you don't know how to release any of that tension except in ways that are not helpful to you and harmful to other people.
Yeah. I really want to encourage people to read the book so they can, we don't want to totally spoil it, but I'd like to talk a little about some current cases and current TV. So your most recent work is executive producer on Bosch.
I'm an executive producer on Bosch. We just finished working on the last season of Bosch, which was
Yes. Right. So full disclosure, Bosch is one of the shows that I will someday for sure watch, that I haven't, that people can't believe I haven't watched, because the people who love it so fiercely.
Yes, they do.
I did get a question from a listener, and she wanted to know if you're involved in the spinoff.
I am not involved in the spinoff, but
Okay.
I know many of the writers who are, and it looks so exciting. And of course, Michael Connelly is definitely involved, and it looks like it's going to be great. Just having been on Bosch and seeing where we were going with all of the characters, I'm so excited to see the show and to see Harry Bosch continue as it does in the books. I think it's going to be great for people who love the books, because you'll get to see Harry in the capacity that he's transitioned into in the books, which is as a PI. And Maddie, his daughter, this is not a spoiler because I think it's already out there, but Maddie, his daughter, is gone into the LAPD police academy. So she's a rookie cop.
That's cool. Okay, people will be excited to know that. So can you watch crime drama and true crime and enjoy it, or is it too much your real life and your work?
No, I love it. I really love crime shows.
Yeah.
I love dissecting them. I enjoy being taken on the ride and just seeing all the twists and turns. And one of the things that I loved with Bosch, I mean, Michael Connelly is such an incredible writer and such a beautiful writer as well, but he really delves into what's happening now. His books are so topical and so right on the mark in terms of current policing. He's very close with many LAPD officers and detectives, and tries really hard to be as authentic as he possibly can to how they do the jobs and the systems that are in place. So I feel like I just enjoy seeing a master really take real life situations and kind of go even deeper into all of these things that we've been talking about, the emotion of it, the trauma of it for the people who are involved, the motivations behind it for not only the cops, but the criminals. So I just love true crime. I feel like it's an endless way to explore the human condition. There's always something new to learn.
Oh my gosh, couldn't agree more. What are you watching and loving right now?
I have been watching a lot of the documentaries on Netflix, I have to say, and it's interesting. Oh, I'm gonna mess up the name of the hotel, but there was one that I just watched that was about a hotel in Los Angeles where a young woman they thought she'd been murdered.
The Cecil.
The
Hotel.
Cecil, that's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So interesting. Also, one of the detectives who was a consultant on Bosch, Tim Marcia, it was a detective on that case, and he's featured in it. So
Oh,
I didn't
very
even
cool.
realize that. So it was fantastic to kind of see his involvement in that. I also just watched the Ted Bundy tapes, which is, again, just, you think so much about these crimes, and there's always so much more to learn. There was another about the Night Stalker, which was fascinating. And again, for me, what's so interesting is when you get to not only look at these crimes from a different perspective, but just see it not only from the victim's perspective, but from the cops who are working the case and how it affects them, and just realizing how much effort, how much drive you really have to keep going on these cases, because it's a real push when you're in the thick of it, to kind of keep going in that way.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And I think of that first one, I forget the title of it, the one about the Cecil Hotel that you're talking about. The other cop that I really remember is Gil Carrillo. And was that his partner? Were they with the man you mentioned? That I loved him. Like he really made an impression on me. It's just because you really saw a window into his personal life.
Right.
They brought their humanity. The documentary allows you to see that, which I always really love.
Yeah.
Is there a case that's cold that you think about and you would love to know the answer to?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. The case that I remember being just kind of spellbound by when it was happening, and my interest in it has only grown, is Mitrice Richardson, the young woman who was killed. Her body was found after an incident where she was, arrested by the LA Sheriff's Department and let go in Malibu Canyon in the middle of the night, and kind of just disappeared in that canyon, and her body was found later. It's such a haunting story, and particularly here in LA, like if you know the terrain of Malibu, it's hard to imagine that she was just let out in the middle of the night and allowed to walk back to her car. It's insane.
Did you listen to the Lost Hills podcast?
Yes.
So I had Dana Goodyear on, so I know the story very well, and that story is haunting and tragic. I mean, what a story.
It's an incredible story. And one of the things that also just struck me about Mitrice was how her mother her mother pushing and trying to get answers, but also the grace with which she approached this. Like she just seemed to be holding it together so well and really staying the course, because I think she knew she needed to get answers. I mean, and of course it hasn't been solved, but if they're, I feel like, gosh, I hope that there are answers out there for that missing period of time when she is wandering around. But it's a fascinating, haunting story.
It really is. And I think she also, in addition to everything you just said, she also called the sheriff's office that night and said, please don't release her until the morning. She doesn't know her way around there. I don't want to wake up to the news about some girl with their head cut off. I mean, that was literally what she said. She had that instinct. She was so aware and connected to her daughter and wanted to make sure she was safe. And then in that period of time, what happened? I mean, it just, it's so hard to get the head around. That's a really good one. Okay, well, I could talk to you all day. This was so great, but I always close my interview asking my guests, the question changes every season. And this season, the listeners have voted for your last meal. If it was, for whatever reason, your last night on earth, what would you eat?
Well, I do have a favorite last meal. It also happens to be my birthday meal. For some reason, this is what I have all the time, probably because this is what my mother would make for me every birthday, but my mother would make paella. So I love a nice paella and then an ice cream cake.
Perfect. Oh my gosh, it's perfect. I love it. And you get to have it once a year and not on the last night of your life, hopefully.
Exactly.
Good. Well, Elle, thank you so much for being on Dialogue. I will point everyone to your wonderful book, and we'll keep, I wanted to ask you, are you working on another show, or what are you working on right now?
I am right now, I'm working on a couple of projects. I have a couple of projects in development, working on a pilot for Amazon and also writing another book. So
Yay.
I'm very busy, and I'm
Good.
looking forward to, having these things enter the world at some point.
Oh, so am I. And I can't wait to find out the show and the book. I will be following your journey
Great.
to make sure that I know. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. This is wonderful. And I really enjoy your show. And I think that it's just such an interesting dialogue. You're doing a fantastic job. So
Well,
thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you for being a part of it and for killing the small talk.